What if the oldest structure on Earth wasn't built at all, but inherited, layer upon layer across 25,000 years, each generation adding to something they didn't create, maintaining walls they couldn't explain, preserving chambers whose purpose was already forgotten when the last ice age ended? What if the terraces that climb Gunung Padang in West Java, green with tropical growth, heavy with silence, aren't the remains of ancient architecture but the surface of something far deeper, a core carved from volcanic rock during an epoch when sea levels were so low that entire continents now lost beneath the waves still connected Indonesia to Asia? The stones sit there still, polygonal basalt columns arranged with an intention that doesn't match a natural formation. Beneath them, ground-penetrating radar reveals voids, chambers, passages, structures extending 30 meters into the mountain's heart. The carbon dates return impossible numbers: 9,000 years, 12,000 years, 27,000 years, each layer older than the last, each layer built upon what came before by people who found the structure already standing, already ancient, already sacred. So before the story pulls you under, take a moment to subscribe, only if you're drawn to histories that question the foundations we build our certainties upon. Tell me where you are listening, and what time it is there. I want to imagine this silence stretching across the world, connecting listeners in the dark, all of us standing before the same question. What was lost when the waters rose, and what have we been trying to remember ever since? Chapter 1, The Mountain That Looked Wrong. In 1914, a Dutch colonial surveyor named N.J. Krom filed a brief report with the Netherlands East Indies Archaeological Service describing an unusual formation in the Karyamukti village of West Java, where local farmers had long avoided cultivating a particular hillside, not because the soil was poor, but because the stones that emerged from the earth seemed wrong. Somehow arranged in patterns that suggested intention rather than accident. Krom noted columnar basalt formations typical of volcanic geology, but observed that the columns appeared to have been moved, repositioned, organised into what he cautiously termed artificial terraces. His report recommended further investigation, but the colonial administration had other priorities and the site was classified as a minor archaeological curiosity requiring no immediate attention. The document was filed in the colonial archives in Batavia, where it would remain largely unread for the next 6 decades, gathering dust while 2 world wars transformed the political landscape of Asia and Indonesia itself emerged from colonial rule into independence. The mountain continued to stand as it had stood for millennia, its terraces slowly disappearing beneath tropical vegetation, its stones settling deeper into the soil, its secrets preserved by the simple fact that no one with the resources to investigate believed there was anything significant to find. This is how anomalies survive in the archaeological record, not through deliberate concealment, but through institutional indifference, through the quiet assumption that anything truly important would already have been recognized, and that sites in peripheral regions far from the established centers of ancient civilization could not possibly challenge the accepted narrative of human development. The surveyor saw something strange and said so, but the system that received his observation had no framework for processing it, and so the observation was absorbed into the archives and forgotten. 65 years later, in 1979, a group of villagers digging irrigation channels on the hillsides flanks unearthed stones that made them pause. These were not the rough volcanic rocks that littered the region, but worked stones carved stones with surfaces too flat and edges too regular to be natural. The villagers reported their discovery to local authorities, who passed the information upward through bureaucratic channels until it reached archaeologists at the Indonesian National Research Centre. A preliminary survey was conducted in 1985, led by a team from the Bandung Institute of Technology, and what they found exceeded the 1914 observations by orders of magnitude. The site covered more than 25 hectares. 5 distinct terraces climbed the hillside, each constructed from massive columnar stones, weighing up to 250 kilograms apiece. At the summit, a flat platform stretched 25 meters across, dominated by arrangements of standing stones that resembled nothing so much as an ancient gathering place, a forum or amphitheatre constructed for purposes the modern investigators could only guess at. The 1985 survey confirmed what the Dutch colonial observer had suspected: the site was artificial, a deliberate construction rather than a natural formation. But the survey team, working within the established chronological framework for Indonesian prehistory, dated the visible structures to the early 1st millennium BCE, roughly 2500 years ago, contemporary with the Bronze Age cultures known to have inhabited Java during that period. The date was comfortable, reassuring, consistent with everything archaeologists believed about the development of complex societies in Southeast Asia. The site was significant, they concluded, but not paradigm-shifting, not dangerous to established timelines, not this kind of discovery that would require anyone to revise textbooks or reconsider assumptions. Gunung Padang entered the archaeological literature as a notable megalithic site warranting preservation and further study, but not as a challenge to the fundamental understanding of human history. And there the matter rested for another quarter century. The terraces continued to weather. The jungle continued to encroach. Villagers continued to make offerings at the summit following traditions whose origins they could not explain, honouring something they sensed was sacred without knowing why. The site waited as it had waited for longer than anyone yet realised for someone to arrive with different questions and different tools and the willingness to look beneath the surface that previous investigations had accepted as the whole story. That person arrived in 2011. Danny Hillman Natawidjaja was not an archaeologist. He was a geologist specialising in seismic hazard assessment for the Indonesian Institute of Sciences, and his interest in Gunung Padangs began not with curiosity about the past, but with concern about the present. The region sits along one of the most seismically active zones on Earth, where the Australian plate subducts beneath the Eurasian plate, generating earthquakes that have shaped both the landscape and the human populations that inhabit it. Natawidjaja was surveying fault lines when he first visited the site, and what he saw made him forget about earthquakes entirely. The stones of the terraces were not simply arranged. He realised they were oriented, precisely aligned along axes that suggested astronomical or geometric intention. More troubling, the soil profiles exposed in erosion channels hinted at depths of human modification far exceeding anything the archaeological surveys had documented. Where archaeologists had seen a surface phenomenon, Natawidjaja, trained to read the geological record, saw evidence of layer upon layer of construction extending deep into the hillside. He returned with ground-penetrating radar equipment designed to map subsurface structures without excavation, and when he processed the first radar images, what he found should have been impossible. Beneath the visible terraces dated to roughly 2,500 years ago lay older structures. Beneath those older structures lay structures older still. The modifications extended more than 30 metres into the hillside chambers, passages, voids, organised spaces that could not be natural, could not be coincidental, could not be explained by any conventional understanding of Indonesian prehistory. The mountain was not a mountain with some stones on top. The mountain was a structure. The stones visible at the surface were only the most recent addition to something far older, something that extended into timescales that made no sense, according to everything archaeology believed about when and where humans became capable of monumental construction. Natawidjaja's initial findings were met with the skepticism appropriate to extraordinary claims. Ground-penetrating radar can produce artifacts, false images that appear structural but result from variations in soil density or moisture content or the complex geology of volcanic regions. But Natawidjaja was a geologist. He understood how to distinguish genuine structures from geological noise, and as he refined his surveys, added additional methodologies and began the slow process of gathering supporting evidence, the anomaly refused to disappear. The structures were there beneath the surface, older than they should be, deeper than they should be, challenging assumptions that the archaeological community had held as settled fact for generations. The 1914 surveyor had seen stones that looked wrong. The 1985 archaeological team had confirmed artificial construction within acceptable timelines. Natawidjaja was seeing something else entirely. He was seeing evidence that the accepted timelines might themselves be wrong, that the neat story of human civilization emerging from the Fertile Crescent spreading outward through documented stages of development might be missing entire chapters buried beneath Southeast Asian hillsides waiting for someone to ask questions that the established paradigm never thought to pose. What followed was a decade of investigation controversy, and the slow accumulation of evidence that remains unresolved to this day. The question was no longer whether Gunung Padang was artificial. The question was how old it actually was and what the answer would mean for everything we thought we knew about human history. Chapter 2: The Evidence Underground. Ground-penetrating radar works by emitting pulses of electromagnetic energy into the Earth and measuring how those pulses reflect off subsurface features. Different materials reflect radar waves differently. Solid rock produces one signature. Packed soil produces another. Voids and chambers produce distinctive patterns that trained analysts can identify with reasonable confidence. The technology was originally developed for locating underground utilities and detecting geological hazards, but archaeologists quickly recognized its potential for non-invasive site investigation, allowing researchers to map what lies beneath the surface without the time, expense, and potential destruction of excavation. When Danny Hillman Natawidjaja deployed ground-penetrating radar at Gunung Padang in 2011, he was using equipment and techniques that had been refined over decades of application to geological and archaeological problems. The methodology was not experimental or unproven. It was standard scientific practice applied to a site that had never received this level of investigation. The radar images revealed a world beneath the terraces that no previous survey had documented. The subsurface of Gunung Padang was not solid volcanic rock with scattered modifications. It was structured. Layer upon layer of organized construction extended into the hillside, each layer distinct from the one above it, each layer suggesting a different phase of building activity. The chambers visible in the radar profiles were not random voids, but rectilinear spaces bounded by walls built from the same columnar basalt that dominated the visible terraces. The passages connecting these chambers followed patterns that suggested intention navigation design. Natawidjaja had found not a single ancient structure, but what appeared to be a palimpsest of structures built one atop another across spans of time that initial analysis could not yet determine. But radar alone could not answer the critical question. How old were these buried structures? Radar reveals shape and position, but not chronology. To establish dates, Natawidjaja needed other methods, and so he assembled a multidisciplinary team that would apply every available technique to the problem. Seismic tomography was the next layer of investigation. This technique works similarly to medical CT scanning, using sound waves rather than radar to build three-dimensional images of subsurface features. By measuring how seismic waves propagate through the hillside and how their velocity changes when they encounter different materials, the team could map the internal structure of Gunung Padang with greater precision than radar alone allowed. The seismic data confirmed and extended the radar findings. The construction extended at least 30 meters into the hillside. Multiple distinct zones were identifiable, each with different acoustic properties suggesting different construction materials or methods. Most significantly, the seismic profiles indicated that the deepest structures were built directly on bedrock, suggesting they represented the original phase of construction upon which all subsequent layers were added. But still, the question of dating remained unanswered. Seismic waves reveal structure, not chronology. The breakthrough came from core sampling. By drilling through the terraces and extracting cylinders of material from different depths, the team could recover organic matter suitable for radiocarbon dating. Carbon-14 dating measures the decay of a radioactive isotope present in all living things. When an organism dies, it stops absorbing new carbon, and the carbon-14 already present begins to decay at a known rate. By measuring how much carbon-14 remains in organic material, archaeologists can determine how long ago that organism died. The technique is standard practice for dating archaeological sites worldwide, and its application to Gunung Padang would prove both revelatory and controversial. The core samples revealed 4 distinct construction layers, each containing organic material that could be dated. The uppermost layer, corresponding to the visible terraces that previous surveys had attributed to Bronze Age construction, yielded dates between 3,000 and 3,500 years before present. This was consistent with the 1985 assessment, reassuring confirmation that at least the surface features fit within established chronologies. But below that uppermost layer, the dates diverged sharply from anything the archaeological community expected. Layer 2, immediately beneath the Bronze Age construction, returned dates between 7,500 and 8,300 years before present. This placed the second phase of construction earlier than Göbekli Tepe, the Turkish site widely celebrated as the oldest known megalithic monument on Earth. Göbekli Tepe, dated to approximately 11,600 years before present, is already considered anomalous, a site that challenges conventional understanding of what hunter-gatherer societies were capable of building. If Gunung Padang's second layer predated the visible structures at Göbekli Tepe by several millennia, the implications were staggering. But Layer 2 was not the deepest. Beneath it lay Layer 3 with radiocarbon dates between 9,000 and 12,500 years before present, contemporary with the Younger Dryas period. the catastrophic cooling event that marked the end of the last ice age. And beneath layer 3 at the deepest levels, the core samples could reach the organic material returned dates that seemed impossible. 25,000 to 27,000 years before present, the last glacial maximum, the coldest period of the last ice age when ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere and sea levels stood 30 meters lower than they do today. According to conventional archaeology, nothing resembling monumental architecture existed anywhere on Earth during this period. The oldest known permanent structures, clay huts and simple stone arrangements, date to perhaps 2,000 years ago and represent the barest beginnings of sedentary existence. Yet here in the highlands of West Java, the radiocarbon dates suggested that someone was building not just simple shelters, but massive stone constructions on a scale that would not be seen elsewhere for another 15,000 years. The evidence demanded explanation, and the explanations that might account for it were all uncomfortable. Perhaps the dating was wrong. Radiocarbon dating can be affected by contamination by the introduction of older or younger carbon into samples, producing misleading results. The team anticipated this objection and submitted samples to multiple laboratories for independent verification. The dates held. Perhaps the organic material was not actually associated with construction. Ancient soil can contain organic matter from many sources, and critics suggested that the dated material might have been deposited naturally, rather than incorporated into construction fill. But the distribution of dated samples across multiple layers with dates that increased consistently with depth argued against random contamination. The pattern suggested deliberate incorporation of organic material during successive construction phases, exactly what would be expected if the site had been built modified and expanded across millennia. Perhaps the structures were natural volcanic features that humans later modified. This objection addressed the oldest dates specifically. Volcanic processes can create columnar basalt formations that appear artificial, and critics argued that the deepest layers might represent natural geology that only later generations shaped into something more clearly architectural. But the ground-penetrating radar and seismic tomography data told a different story. The deepest structures showed the same organized rectilinear geometry as the upper layers. The chambers were chambers, not lava tubes. The walls were walls, not fracture planes. Whatever produced these features did so with intention. The implications of accepting the dates at face value were so disruptive that resistance was inevitable and perhaps appropriate. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the claim that monumental architecture existed in Southeast Asia more than 2,000 years before the pyramids of Egypt demanded scrutiny that the initial studies could not fully provide. What the evidence suggested, however, was worth stating plainly. If the radiocarbon dates accurately reflected the construction sequence of Gunung Padang, then the site was not a single monument but a continuously maintained structure spanning most of the last 30,000 years. The deepest core carved from volcanic bedrock during the coldest phase of the last ice age. The next layer added as the ice age ended and the world transformed around it. The next as Göbekli Tepe rose in distant Anatolia, and as the Nile Valley first saw permanent settlement. The surface layer added in the Bronze Age when the Shang dynasty ruled China, and the Olmec carved their first colossal heads in Mesoamerica, each generation inheriting a structure they did not build. Each generation adding their own contribution to something already ancient, each generation maintaining a connection to a past that even they, perhaps, did not fully understand. This is not how we imagine the development of civilization. We imagine progress as a line moving forward, each generation building on the achievements of the last in a continuous accumulation of knowledge and capability. Gunung Padang suggests a different pattern: inheritance, recovery, the maintenance of something given, rather than the creation of something new. The question of what this evidence means cannot be separated from the question of how the evidence was received, and that reception reveals as much about the present as the structure reveals about the past. Chapter 3: The Controversy and the Silence. In 2014, the Indonesian government declared Gunung Padang a national priority site, allocating funding for expanded research and placing the investigation under the direct oversight of a presidential task force. For a brief moment, it appeared that the questions raised by Natawidjaja's findings would receive the sustained institutional attention they required. Indonesian media covered the site extensively. International news organizations picked up the story. The phrase "oldest pyramid in the world" circulated widely, often stripping nuance from claims that the researchers themselves had presented more cautiously. And then the backlash began. The international archaeological community responded to the Indonesian enthusiasm with pointed skepticism. The radiocarbon dates were questioned. The radar interpretations were challenged. The very premise that Southeast Asia could have been home to monumental construction millennia before the established centres of civilization was treated as inherently implausible a claim so extraordinary that no evidence currently available could justify it. A group of prominent Indonesian archaeologists published an open letter in 2014 warning that the Gunung Padang research was proceeding without adequate peer review and risked embarrassing the nation with unfounded claims. International researchers echoed these concerns, noting methodological questions that had not been fully addressed. The controversy centred on several technical objections. First, the radiocarbon dating samples had been extracted from soil rather than from clearly anthropogenic contexts. Carbon in soil can migrate. Older carbon can be transported downward by a water infiltration. The dates might reflect the age of geological deposits rather than construction events. Second, the radar and seismic interpretations were challenged by researchers who argued that volcanic geology could produce features resembling artificial chambers without any human involvement. Third, and perhaps most fundamentally, the claims conflicted with everything the archaeological profession had established about the timeline of human cultural development. The Neolithic Revolution. The transition from hunter-gathering to agriculture that enabled population growth, specialization and eventually monumental construction was understood to have occurred between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, beginning in the Fertile Crescent and spreading outward from there. For monumental architecture to exist in Indonesia 25,000 years ago would require either independent invention of complex society far earlier than anywhere else, or contact with an unknown civilization whose existence had left no other trace. Both possibilities seemed so unlikely that many researchers concluded the dates must simply be wrong. These objections were not frivolous. They represented legitimate scientific concerns about methodology and interpretation. But the response to those concerns revealed something troubling about how the archaeological profession handles anomalous data, rather than funding expanded research to resolve the methodological questions. Critics called for the research to be halted. Rather than treating the site as an opportunity to test the boundaries of current understanding, many archaeologists treated it as a threat to hard-won professional consensus. The pattern was familiar. When evidence challenges established paradigms, the initial response is often not investigation, but dismissal. The 2023 publication changed the conversation without resolving it. In October of that year, a peer-reviewed paper appeared in the journal Archaeological Prospection, co-authored by Natawijaja and researchers from institutions in Indonesia, Australia, and the United States. The paper presented a comprehensive analysis of the ground-penetrating radar seismic tomography and radiocarbon data collected over the previous decade. The methodology was rigorous, the sample sizes were substantial, the statistical analysis was sophisticated, and the conclusions were carefully stated. The evidence suggests that Gunung Padang is not a natural hill but a multi-layered artificial construction. The deepest layers appear to date to the last glacial maximum. Further excavation is needed to confirm these findings. The publication in a respected peer-reviewed journal marked a significant shift. The claims were no longer speculation presented at press conferences, they were documented research subjected to the review process that gives scientific findings their authority. The professional gatekeepers had evaluated the methodology and found it sufficient for publication. And yet the major archaeological journals remained silent. Science and Nature did not cover the paper. The Journal of World Prehistory and Antiquity published no commentary. The organizations that might be expected to coordinate international investigation offered no response. The silence was perhaps more telling than outright rejection would have been. Rejection at least acknowledges the existence of a challenge. Silence treats the challenge as unworthy of engagement, as something that can be simply ignored until it goes away. This pattern of institutional response raises questions that extend beyond Gunung Padang to the nature of scientific paradigms themselves. Thomas Kuhn's famous analysis of scientific revolutions argued that paradigms do not change through gradual accumulation of contradictory evidence. They resist. They absorb anomalies. They develop epicycles and exceptions that protect the core framework from fundamental challenge. Only when anomalies accumulate beyond the capacity of the paradigm to contain them does revolutionary change become possible, and even then the transition is often generational. the old guard retiring before the new framework can fully establish itself. Gunung Padang may represent exactly this kind of challenge. If the dates are accurate, the entire framework of the Neolithic Revolution as the origin point of human civilization requires revision. The neat story of development from hunter-gathering to agriculture to complex society to monumentality becomes partial, incomplete, a description of what happened in some places, but not necessarily what happened first or only. Southeast Asia, rather than the Middle East, might emerge as the origin point of architectural achievement. The peoples conventionally classified as primitive inhabitants of tropical forests might prove to have been heirs to traditions stretching back to the Ice Age. Everything changes. And when everything changes, resistance is not surprising. Careers are built on existing paradigms. Funding flows to research that extends current understanding, not to research that threatens to overturn it. Institutions develop cultures and hierarchies that favour consensus over disruption. The social and professional incentives for accepting anomalous evidence are weak, while the incentives for dismissing it are strong. This does not mean the skeptics are wrong, it does not mean the dates are necessarily accurate. It means that the process by which we determine what is true is itself shaped by forces other than pure truth-seeking, and that awareness of those forces is necessary for honest evaluation of controversial claims. What would change if Gunung Padang's dates were accepted? The immediate implications would be archaeological, but the deeper implications would be philosophical. If humans were capable of monumental construction during the last glacial maximum, then the question of what else they were capable of becomes open in ways it currently is not. The absence of evidence for Ice Age civilization would no longer be evidence of absence, it would be evidence of loss of destruction on a scale that erased all but scattered fragments of what once existed. The flood myths that appear in every ancient culture might take on different meaning. Not mythology, but memory. Not imagination, but inherited trauma from a catastrophe that ended a world. And the patterns that the Mesopotamians described knowledge inherited rather than invented civilization as recovery rather than invention might prove to be more than symbolic, more than theological, more than the universal human tendency to imagine golden ages in the distant past. They might prove to be accurate. The controversy over Gunung Padang remains unresolved. The excavation that could definitively answer the dating questions has not been conducted. The Indonesian government has prioritised preservation over investigation, reasoning that protecting the site for future research is more important than risking damage through premature excavation. International archaeological organisations have not offered the funding or expertise that might resolve the methodological questions. The site waits as it has waited for millennia for someone to look closely enough and long enough to understand what it actually is. But even in its unresolved state, Gunung Padang raises questions that deserve consideration. What if the evidence we have already found is enough to justify expanded investigation? What if the extraordinary claims have already provided extraordinary evidence, and the only thing lacking is the institutional willingness to take that evidence seriously? What if somewhere in the highlands of West Java, carved into volcanic rock and buried beneath 30 meters of subsequent construction, lies proof that human history is far older, far stranger, and far more complex than the textbooks acknowledge? The silence from the archaeological establishment is not an answer. It is an evasion, and evasion in the face of evidence is itself a kind of evidence. Evidence of something unresolved, evidence of something waiting, evidence of a question that will not disappear simply because those with the authority to answer it have chosen not to try. Chapter 4, What the Structure Actually Looks Like. The road to Gunung Padang winds through the Kanjur Regency of West Java, climbing gradually from the lowland heat into cooler elevations where the air thickens with moisture and the smell of volcanic soil rises after every rain. You pass through villages where concrete gives way to wood and thatch, where motorbikes share narrow lanes with farmers carrying bundles of rice stalks, where children pause their games to watch unfamiliar vehicles pass. The rice paddies stretch in terraced sheets of green and gold, water catching sunlight in fragments, each paddy a mirror reflecting clouds that drift across Mount Gede in the distance. This is agricultural land, worked for centuries, unremarkable to those who live here except for one detail that disrupts the ordinary rhythm of planting and harvest. Ahead, rising above the tree line, a hill climbs higher than its neighbours, its slopes too regular, its terraces too deliberate, its presence somehow heavier than geology alone can explain. The locals call it Gunung Padang, the Mountain of Enlightenment. though the name has drifted so far from its origins that no one living can say with certainty what enlightenment was sought there or by whom. What they know, what their grandparents knew, what the oral traditions preserve without explaining is that this mountain is different. You do not farm its slopes, you do not cut its stones for building material, you do not linger there after dark. The mountain holds something, and whatever it holds has commanded respect long enough that the respecting itself has become tradition, unexamined but absolute. The approach on foot begins where the road ends, at a parking area that during peak visiting hours fills with tour buses and private cars, with vendors selling bottled water and snacks, with guides offering their services in Indonesian and broken English. From there, a path of fitted stones leads upward through forest that closes in quickly, bamboo and tropical hardwoods, creating a canopy that filters the sunlight into shifting green patterns on the ground. The air is dense, humid, carrying the sounds of insects and distant birds, the occasional call of a monkey moving through branches overhead. The stones beneath your feet are the first indication that something is unusual about this place. They are not the rough field stones of a village path. They are columnar basalt, naturally formed into polygonal shapes by the cooling of volcanic magma millions of years ago, but arranged here with a regularity that volcanic chance cannot explain. Each stone fits against its neighbours with minimal gaps. The path rises at a consistent grade, the edges align. This is not nature. This is intention expressed through natural materials, and the distinction becomes clearer with every step. The first terrace appears after perhaps 10 minutes of climbing, a broad flat platform extending outward from the hillside, its surface covered with the same columnar basalt stones now lying horizontal, fitted together like the tiles of an enormous floor. The terrace measures approximately 25 metres in length and perhaps 15 metres in width, though vegetation has encroached enough that precise dimensions require the surveying equipment of archaeological teams rather than the naked eye. What strikes you immediately is not the size but the regularity. Each stone is positioned with its natural flat surface facing upward. Each stone is aligned with its neighbours along consistent axes. The gaps between stones are narrow and uniform, too uniform for random placement, too consistent for the gradual arrangement of stones moved by erosion or root-cause growth over centuries. Someone chose these stones, someone positioned them, someone understood that their natural geometry could serve an architectural purpose if arranged according to a plan. And that plan, whatever its ultimate meaning, was executed with precision that requires not just labour but coordination, not just strength but measurement, not just time but intention sustained across the duration of construction. Standing on the first terrace, you begin to understand why the early Dutch surveyors who visited this site in the colonial period dismissed it as a natural formation with minor human modification. The stones themselves are natural. Columnar basalt occurs wherever volcanic lava cools slowly enough to contract into regular geometric patterns, and Indonesia, sitting on the Pacific Ring of Fire, produces such formations routinely. What is not natural is the arrangement. What is not natural is the stacking. What is not natural is the consistency that extends across the entire visible surface, and, as later surveys would reveal, deep into the earth below. The path continues upward through 4 more terraces, each distinct in its construction, each representing what the archaeological surveys now suggest was a different phase of building. The second terrace is narrower than the first, its stones smaller and more densely packed, its surface showing evidence of what appears to be deliberate patterning, rows of stones oriented in alternating directions that create a visual rhythm even through the patina of moss and lichen that covers their surfaces. The third terrace extends the pattern further, adding what appear to be low walls or raised platforms at regular intervals along its length, structures that might have served as seats or altars or markers whose purpose we can only guess. The fourth terrace narrows again, climbing more steeply, the stones here larger and more roughly arranged, as though this section was either less finished than the others, or constructed by different hands following different principles. And then you reach the fifth and final terrace, the summit, where the arrangement of stones shifts into something more clearly deliberate than anything below. The summit terrace is dominated by what visitors and researchers have come to call the pavilion, though the term may import assumptions about function that the evidence does not support. It consists of a rectangular platform approximately 9 metres by 9 metres, formed from large flat stones arranged in concentric layers, rising slightly toward the center to create a gentle dome shape. Around this central platform, smaller groupings of upright stones stand at irregular intervals, some reaching nearly 2 meters in height, their surfaces rough and unworked except where natural fracture planes have created flat faces that now orient outward as though intended to be seen. These megaliths are not the columnar basalt of the terraces below. They are andesite and other volcanic rocks, heavier and denser, their presence here requiring either significant labour to transport from elsewhere or deliberate selection from stone available at this specific location. The megaliths do not form obvious patterns when viewed from ground level. Their arrangement appears almost random, clusters of 2 or 3 stones here, a single upright there, gaps that might be intentional spacing or might reflect stones that have fallen and been removed over millennia. But aerial photography tells a different story. Viewed from above, the stone groupings begin to suggest geometries that the ground-level observer cannot perceive. Linear arrangements pointing towards specific directions on the compass. Circular patterns whose centres align with natural features of the landscape. Relationships between stone positions that imply measurement and planning rather than random placement over time. What lies beneath the visible surface is where Gunung Padang transforms from an interesting archaeological site into something that challenges the framework through which we understand human prehistory. Ground-penetrating radar, first deployed systematically at the site in 2011 by geologist Danny Hillman Natawijaja and his team, sends electromagnetic pulses into the earth and measures how those pulses reflect off buried structures, voids, and changes in soil density. The technology cannot tell us exactly what lies below, but it can tell us that something lies below, something with consistent shapes and regular boundaries that distinguish it from the random variations of natural geology. The radar images from Gunung Padang show anomalies extending to depths of 30 meters beneath the visible terraces. Some of these anomalies appear as linear features, possible walls or partitions running at right angles to each other. Others appear as voids, open spaces within the solid earth that suggest chambers or passages, hollowed out by construction rather than by erosion or volcanic activity. The deepest anomalies, those appearing at 25 to 30 meters below the surface, show the most regular geometries, rectangular forms with consistent dimensions, arranged in patterns that the researchers describe as architectural rather than geological. Seismic tomography adds another layer of evidence, measuring how vibrations travel through the subsurface and mapping the density variations that would indicate constructed rather than natural features. The tomographic images broadly confirm what the radar suggested. Dense material at certain depths arranged in geometric patterns. Lower density voids between those dense areas suggesting chambers or passages. A layered structure in which different construction phases appear to lie atop one another, each burial of an older phase preceding the construction of a newer one above. What emerges from the combined surveys is a picture of Gunung Padang not as a single structure but as accumulated structure, layers of buildings separated by layers of fill, ascending through what the dating suggests may be tens of thousands of years. The visible terraces, the stones we walk upon when we visit the site, represent only the most recent phase of construction, the uppermost layer of something that extends far deeper and far further back in time than the surface reveals. Core samples drilled through the terraces and into the earth below bring physical material to the surface that the remote sensing can only infer. At shallow depths, the cores recover soil mixed with fragments of worked stone, organic material from vegetation, and charcoal from fires whose sources we cannot determine with certainty. Cooking fires perhaps, or ritual burning, or the remains of construction activities that required heat. The carbon-14 dates from these shallow layers return figures consistent with what conventional archaeology expects, 3,000 to 3,500 years before present, placing this construction phase in the Bronze Age, contemporary with the development of sophisticated cultures elsewhere in the Indonesian archipelago. There is nothing anomalous about these dates. They confirm what the surface appearance suggested, that people were building here, arranging stones with intention, creating terraced platforms on this hillside, at a time when similar construction was occurring at sites throughout Southeast Asia. But the cores do not stop at the shallow layers. They continue downward through fill that the radar and seismic surveys indicated was deliberately deposited to bury earlier construction. And as they penetrate deeper, the dates grow older. At approximately 3 to 5 meters below the surface, organic samples return dates of 7,500 to 8,300 years before present. This is older than Göbekli Tepe, the Turkish site that has reshaped archaeological understanding of monumental construction by demonstrating that hunter-gatherers could build in stone before they developed agriculture. If these dates from Gunung Padang are accurate, they suggest that Southeast Asia, not the Fertile Crescent, may have been the location of humanity's earliest monumental architecture. The construction at this depth consists of columnar basalts similar to the surface layers but arranged in patterns that the researchers describe as distinct, a different architectural vocabulary suggesting different builders, or at least different phases of development within a continuing tradition. Deeper still, at approximately 8 to 15 meters below the surface, the dates leap further backward. Organic material from these layers returns figures between 9,000 and 12,000 years before present. This places the construction firmly in the period following the last glacial maximum, a time when sea levels were still far below their modern positions, when the Indonesian archipelago was not yet an archipelago, but the mountainous eastern edge of a vast subcontinent now drowned. The radar images from these depths show what appear to be more substantial structures than those above, larger chambers, thicker walls, more regular geometries. If the surveys are accurate, the builders at this phase were not amateurs experimenting with stone arrangement. They were architects working within established principles, creating spaces whose purposes we can only guess, but whose construction required sophisticated understanding of materials and loads and structural integrity. And then the cores reach the deepest layers, the anomalies that lie 25 to 30 meters below the visible surface, and the dates return numbers that the archaeological establishment has largely refused to engage with seriously, 25,000 to 10,000 years before present. The last glacial maximum itself, a time when conventional archaeology tells us that humans lived as small bands of hunter-gatherers, moving seasonally in pursuit of game, creating art in caves but not monuments on mountains, surviving the cold epochs through flexibility and cooperation, but not through the organised labour that monumental construction requires. The dates from these deepest layers suggest that something was happening at Gunung Padang during the Ice Age that our models do not anticipate, that our categories do not accommodate, that our timelines do not include. If the dates are accurate, the core of this structure predates the end of the Ice Age by 10,000 years. It predates the rise of sea levels that would drown Sunderland. It predates everything we call civilization by a span of time longer than civilization itself has existed, and it raises a question that the silence of the archaeological establishment cannot answer by ignoring. Who built this? And how? And why? And what happened to them when the world changed? The comparison to other megalithic sites illuminates what makes Gunung Padang anomalous by contrast. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, excavated systematically since 95, has demonstrated that monumental stone construction can predate agriculture by millennia, with its massive T-shaped pillars dating to approximately 11,600 years before present. But Göbekli Tepe, for all its significance, is younger than what the deep cores from Gunung Padang suggest lies beneath the Indonesian site. Stonehenge in England, perhaps the most famous megalithic monument in the world, dates to approximately 5,000 years before present in its earliest phases, making it contemporary with Egypt's Old Kingdom pyramids and the first Mesopotamian ziggurats. These are the monuments that define our understanding of human architectural capability, and all of them are younger than even the middle layers of Gunung Padang, let alone its Ice Age core. The Giza Plateau, with its pyramids and sphinx, represents the pinnacle of ancient construction as conventionally understood, dated to approximately 400 years before present, and located in a region where continuous historical records allow us to contextualize the builders within a known civilization. But the oldest phase of Gunung Padang, if the dating holds, was already ancient when the Egyptians laid the first stones of the Great Pyramid, already buried beneath successive layers of construction, already forgotten by whoever maintained the visible terraces that later generations would interpret as the totality of the site. What distinguishes Gunung Padang from all these comparisons is not simply age, but methodology. The stones at Göbekli Tepe were quarried and transported, carved from limestone bedrock at sites located some distance from the construction and moved to their current positions through labour, whose logistics we can only estimate. The sarsens and bluestones of Stonehenge were similarly transported, some from sources over 150 miles away, representing organizational capability that implies sophisticated social structures. The pyramid blocks at Giza were cut from quarries and moved along prepared causeways, lifted into position by techniques that continue to inspire debate and speculation. But the stone at Gunung Padang is different. The columnar basalt that forms the terraces was not quarried elsewhere and transported to the site. It was carved in place. The mountain itself was the raw material. The structure emerged not through addition of external elements, but through the revealing of form already present within the volcanic rock. The removal of what was not needed to expose what the builders intended. This is not construction as we typically understand it. This is more akin to sculpture, the negative process of removing material to reveal the image already waiting within the stone, applied to architecture at a scale that transforms an entire mountain into monument. The acoustic properties of the underground chambers add another layer of complexity that purely visual surveys cannot capture. At megalithic sites worldwide, researchers have discovered that certain chamber geometries produce specific acoustic effects, resonances that amplify particular frequencies, reflections that create echo patterns, standing waves that can produce what researchers call archaeoacoustic phenomena. Studies at sites including Newgrange in Ireland, the Hypogeum of Halsafliani in Malta, and the Great Kiva structures of the American Southwest have documented chambers that resonate at frequencies corresponding to human vocal ranges, creating effects that would have intensified ritual chanting or drumming. Infrasound frequencies below the threshold of conscious human hearing has been detected in some of these spaces, vibrations that research suggests can induce physiological effects including feelings of presence, unease, or altered perception. The chambers beneath Gunung Padang have not been systematically studied for acoustic properties because systematic study would require excavation, and excavation has been limited by the Indonesian government's prioritization of preservation. But preliminary measurements at accessible points suggest that the buried spaces may possess resonant properties consistent with the pattern observed elsewhere, suggesting that the structure may have been designed not merely as architecture, but as technology. Space is engineered to produce specific experiential effects on those who entered them. Standing on the summit terrace today, looking out across the landscape toward distant volcanic peaks still active, still building new land from magma, still demonstrating the geological forces that created the raw material these ancient builders worked, you begin to understand that Gunung Padang is not simply an old building. It is a hybrid entity, part mountain and part monument, its construction inseparable from the geological processes that formed its substance, its meaning embedded in a relationship between human intention and volcanic reality that we can observe but cannot yet fully interpret. The stones that form the visible surface are younger than the stones that form the buried core. The terraces that visitors walk upon are merely the most recent expression of something that extends backward through time and downward through wuel in ways the visible cannot communicate. This is not a ruin in the conventional sense, the remains of something that once stood complete and has since decayed. This is a living geological and architectural hybrid, a structure that may have been continuously maintained across epochs, each generation adding to what it inherited, each phase of construction bearing and preserving what came before. The question is not what Gunung Padang was, the question is what it has been across the entire span of its existence, and what that continuity suggests about the people who built it, maintained it, buried it, built upon it again, and ultimately forgot what they were preserving even as they continued to preserve it. Who were those builders, and what world did they inhabit, and why did they expend such extraordinary effort on this particular mountain at this particular place? The answer, if it can be found, lies somewhere between 25,000 years of accumulated construction and the limits of what our current models of human prehistory can accommodate. Chapter 5: The Impossible Builders. 25,000 years before the present day, the world existed in a state that would be unrecognizable to anyone familiar only with modern geography. The ice sheets that had been accumulating for tens of thousands of years reached their maximum extent during the period geologists call the last glacial maximum. Vast frozen masses covering much of northern Europe, northern Asia too, and North America to depths exceeding 3 kilometers in places. The weight of this ice pressed down on continental plates, deforming the shape of the Earth itself, while the water locked within the ice lowered global sea levels by approximately 30 meters below their current position. Coastlines extended far beyond where they lie today. The English Channel was dry land, walkable from Dover to Calais. The Bering Strait was a broad plain connecting Asia to the Americas, and Southeast Asia, the region we now imagine as an archipelago of thousands of islands separated by tropical seas, was something entirely different, a subcontinent. Sunderland, as geologists and archaeologists have named this drowned landmass, extended from the current coastlines of Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand and Malaysia, southward and eastward across what is now the South China Sea, the Java Sea and the Strait of Malacca. It connected the modern islands of Sumatra, Java and Borneo to the Asian mainland in an unbroken expanse of tropical lowland, river deltas, coastal plains and forested hills. The exposed continental shelf that formed this landmass was not the barren underwater desert that modern seafloor mapping reveals beneath the accumulated sediment of 14,000 years of submersion. During the Ice Age, Sunderland was one of the most hospitable regions on Earth for human habitation, blessed with warm temperatures, abundant rainfall, rich biodiversity, and the resources that tropical environments provide year-round, without the seasonal scarcity that forced adaptation among populations living in colder latitudes. The rivers that now flow into the South China Sea and the Java Sea once carved valleys through exposed land, creating watersheds that would have concentrated both wildlife and human populations along their banks. The Mekong, the Chao Phraya, and the combined ancestral rivers of Sumatra and Borneo drained into basins that no longer exist above water. Their courses now submerged and filled with marine sediment that obscures their former paths. Population centres, if they existed during the Ice Age, would logically have developed along these riverine highways, following the water and the life it sustained. And those population centres, whatever they were, whatever cultures and technologies and social structures they developed, lie beneath 40 to 100 metres of ocean today, inaccessible to conventional archaeology, invisible to the tools we use to excavate the human past. Gunung Padang sits at the eastern edge of what was Sunderland, on the mountainous terrain that remained above sea level as the glaciers began to melt and the waters began to rise. If civilization existed in the lowlands of Sunderland during the Ice Age, if populations had developed the social organisation and construction techniques necessary to build monumentally, then Gunung Padang occupies precisely the location where refugees from the rising waters would have fled. The structure might not represent the origin of an Ice Age culture. It might represent its final outpost, its memorial, its attempt to preserve something essential on high ground as everything below disappeared beneath the advancing seas. Modern genetic studies complicate and enrich this picture. Analysis of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome markers in contemporary Southeast Asian populations reveals patterns of deep antiquity, lineages that diverge from other human groups tens of thousands of years ago, and have maintained relative isolation ever since. The indigenous peoples of the Andaman Islands in the Bay of Bengal carry genetic signatures suggesting separation from other human populations as long as 60,000 years ago. The Orang Asli of peninsular Malaysia, the Aboriginal populations who predate Malay settlement, show similar ancient lineages. Australian Aboriginal peoples, who reached their continent by crossing the waters between Sunderland and the Sahul Shelf at least 65,000 years ago, represent another branch of this deep ancestral tree. These are among the oldest continuous human lineages outside of Africa, peoples whose ancestors walked the coasts and forests of Sunderland when ice still covered Europe, when Neanderthals still inhabited Eurasia, when the world was configured in ways we struggle to imagine. These populations have traditionally been classified by anthropologists and archaeologists as hunter-gatherers, a term that describes subsistence strategy rather than cognitive capacity, but that has accumulated connotations of simplicity, primitiveness, lack of development. Hunter-gatherers do not build cities. Hunter-gatherers do not create monumental architecture. Hunter-gatherers live in small mobile bands following seasonal resources, rather than settling in permanent locations and investing generations of labour in constructed environments. The classification has served as an assumption so fundamental to archaeological thinking that evidence contradicting it tends to be dismissed rather than incorporated. When Göbekli Tepe revealed that hunter-gatherers in Anatolia had built massively in stone 1,600 years ago, the discovery required rewriting textbooks and revising paradigms because it violated the assumed correlation between agricultural settlement and architectural capability. Gunung Padang, and if its deepest dates are accurate, violates that correlation even more dramatically pushing the capacity for monumental construction back another 15,000 years and locating it not in the Fertile Crescent but in tropical Southeast Asia, among populations we have consistently underestimated. The question that Gunung Padang forces us to ask is not whether hunter-gatherers built it, but what we mean when we use that term and whether the category itself has obscured as much as it has illuminated. Subsistence strategy is not destiny. A population that hunts and gathers can also observe the stars, track seasonal cycles, develop sophisticated knowledge of plant and animal behavior, create complex social hierarchies, transmit information across generations through oral tradition, and yes, organize collective labor toward construction projects whose purposes we might struggle to understand. The absence of agriculture does not imply the absence of surplus. A tropical environment abundant in year-round resources might generate leisure time, not through stored grain, but through the reliable availability of foraged food, time that could be directed toward projects whose value is spiritual or social or cosmological rather than economic. The Göbekli Tepe paradox, as some researchers have called it, suggests that monumental construction might actually precede and motivate agricultural development rather than follow from it. The theory proposes that the labour demands of building and maintaining large stone structures could have incentivized the domestication of grain crops to feed the workers, creating agriculture as a secondary development in service of ritual architecture, rather than as a precondition for it. If this pattern held at Göbekli Tepe 1600 years ago, could it have held at Gunung Padang even earlier? Could the populations of Ice Age Sunderland have developed their own trajectory toward complex social organisation and monumental building, a trajectory interrupted or transformed when the rising seas forced abandonment of their lowland homelands? The archaeological evidence from Southeast Asia prior to the post-glacial period is almost entirely absent, not because nothing happened, but because everything that happened occurred in regions now underwater. The earliest archaeological sites in the Indonesian archipelago date to only about 45,000 years ago, representing the first modern human arrivals in a region that became islands only after the Ice Age ended. But these early sites are found on what was then marginal highland terrain, the mountains and elevated areas that remained above water when Sunderland drowned, the lowlands where population would have concentrated, where resources would have been richest, where any developing civilization would logically have centered, are inaccessible. We are trying to reconstruct the history of a subcontinent by examining only its mountaintops, and we are surprised that the picture appears incomplete. What we know about the populations who inhabited Southeast Asia during the Ice Age must be inferred largely from what came after, from the cultures that emerged in the post-glacial period bearing traces of older traditions whose origins remain obscure. The Austronesian expansion, beginning around 5,000 years ago, spread languages and cultural practices from Taiwan throughout the Pacific Islands, Madagascar, Tomis, and maritime Southeast Asia. But the Austronesians were relatively recent arrivals in a region that had been inhabited for tens of thousands of years before them. The cultures they encountered, the populations they absorbed or displaced, carried their own traditions whose depth the Austronesians themselves may not have understood. Could those traditions have included memories, however distorted, of a time when their ancestors built in stone on mountains that looked down upon cities now beneath the waves? The oral traditions of indigenous Southeast Asian populations contain tantalizing fragments that resist interpretation. Stories of ancestral homelands lost to rising waters, narratives of great floods that destroyed earlier worlds, descriptions of ancient builders whose works were greater than anything modern people could accomplish. These stories have generally been classified as mythology, explanatory narratives developed to account for geological and archaeological features whose true origins were unknown. But the same dismissive classification was once applied to the Greek tales of Troy until Schliemann excavated Hisarlik, to the biblical flood narratives until flood layers were discovered beneath Mesopotamian cities, to the Aboriginal accounts of ancient coastlines until sea level reconstructions confirmed their accuracy. Mythology can be distorted memory. Oral tradition can preserve truths across millennia even when the meaning of those truths has been forgotten. The humans who lived in Southeast Asia 25,000 years ago were anatomically and cognitively identical to humans today. Their brains were the same size, structured the same way, capable of the same abstract thought, symbolic communication, and complex problem-solving that has characterized our species for at least 3,000 years. The question is not whether they could have built Gunung Padang, but whether the conditions existed that would have motivated them to build it. The conventional answer has been no. that only agricultural surplus generates the labour organisation necessary for monumental construction, that only settled populations invest in permanent architecture, that only stratified societies with religious or political elites directing labour create structures requiring decades or centuries to complete. But these answers are derived from the evidence that survived, from the civilizations whose remains we can excavate and study, from the timeline that begins with the end of the Ice Age and treats everything before as prelude. If Gunung Padang's deepest dates are accurate, the conventional answers are not merely incomplete, they are wrong. The people who built the core of Gunung Padang, whoever they were, possessed knowledge we have not recovered and capabilities we have not acknowledged. They understood how to work volcanic stone at massive scale, shaping columnar basalt in place rather than quarrying and transporting it. They understood how to create chambers and passages whose geometries suggest intentional design rather than natural formation. They understood how to organize labour across generations, maintaining construction projects whose completion no individual participant would live to see. And they understood that what they were building mattered enough to justify the investment, mattered across timescales that implied either immortal gods directing the work or mortal humans convinced that their descendants would continue what they began. We do not know their names, we do not know their language, we do not know whether they thought of themselves as a single people or as many peoples united by shared tradition. We know only that they existed, that they built, and that what they built has outlasted everything else they created, waiting beneath accumulated layers of earth and time for someone to ask who they were. Chapter 6: Sacred Mountains and Star Chambers. Throughout the Indonesian archipelago, volcanic mountains occupy a position in cosmology that Western categories struggle to capture. They are not merely landscape features, not simply dangerous or resource-rich terrain, not only the geological reality of a region sitting on the Pacific Ring of Fire, where tectonic plates collide and magma rises perpetually toward the surface. They are axis mundi, the vertical connections between the world humans inhabit and the realms above and below, the physical points where Earth meets sky and where communication between mortal and divine becomes possible. The word Gunung, mountain, carries sacred connotations that the English translation cannot convey, implications of power and presence and ancestral authority that have shaped religious practice across the region for as long as records and oral traditions extend. Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain at the centre of Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, finds its earthly representatives throughout Indonesia in the volcanic peaks that rise above the tropical lowlands. Balinese temples orient themselves toward the sacred mountains of their island, treating elevation as proximity to the divine. Javanese kingdoms built their capitals in deliberate relationship to the volcanoes that dominate their horizons, deriving legitimacy from association with the powers those mountains embody. The court of Majapahit, the great Hindu Javanese empire that dominated maritime Southeast Asia from the 13th to 15th centuries, positioned itself in cosmological alignment with Mount Penanggungan, treating the volcano as a manifestation of Mount Meru itself. This was not metaphor but architecture, not symbolism but practical construction of sacred geography through which human civilization took its place within cosmic order. Borobudur, the massive Buddhist monument constructed in central Java around the 8th and 9th centuries, represents the most elaborate architectural expression of this mountain cosmology. Its 9 stacked platforms rising in diminishing terraces toward a central stupa replicate the structure of Mount Meru in constructed form, creating a pilgrim's path that ascends through successive realms of Buddhist cosmology, from the material world of desire through the world of forms to the formless realm of enlightenment. The pilgrim walks the galleries, contemplating the relief panels that line the walls, ascending physically and spiritually through narrative sequences depicting the Buddha's teachings and previous lives. The mountain is not represented at Borobudur. The mountain is replicated. The monument is an artificial volcano built to serve the same cosmological function as the natural volcanoes that had been serving that function for uncounted centuries before Buddhist missionaries arrived, with their own theological frameworks to overlay upon existing practice. Gunung Padang, if we take seriously both its physical structure and its cultural context, may represent the earliest known expression of this mountain cosmology in architectural form. The terraced ascent from base to summit, the careful arrangement of volcanic stone into platforms and gathering spaces, the buried chambers that penetrate into the earth below and cease, all suggest a construction designed not merely to impress or to shelter, but to instantiate cosmological principles in physical form. The mountain was already sacred before anyone built upon it, sacred because of what mountains are in this cultural framework: connections between worlds, dwelling places of ancestors and spirits, points where the boundary between seen and unseen grows thin. The construction did not create the sanctity. The construction expressed and enhanced and made architecturally accessible a sanctity that the mountain already possessed. Preliminary studies of the orientation of features at Gunung Padang suggest astronomical alignments that, if confirmed by systematic archaeoastronomy, would indicate that the builders incorporated celestial observation into their construction planning. Certain linear arrangements of stones appear to point toward positions on the horizon where the sun rises or sets at the solstices, the extreme points of the solar year that traditional cultures worldwide have marked as moments of cosmological significance. Other alignments may relate to the movements of the moon or the rising positions of significant stars, though the data required to confirm these relationships has not been systematically gathered. The site remains understudied not because the questions are uninteresting, but because the political and institutional complexities of arranging major archaeological investigations at a site that sits at the intersection of Indonesian national identity, local religious practice, and international scientific controversy have prevented the sustained research that could provide answers. What we can say with confidence is that astronomical alignment would be consistent with what we know about megalithic sites worldwide. Stonehenge famously aligns with the midsummer sunrise. Newgrange in Ireland channels the midwinter sunrise through a precisely engineered roof box to illuminate its inner chamber for a few minutes on the shortest days of the year. The Egyptian pyramids incorporate alignments to cardinal directions and to the positions of stars in the northern sky. Göbekli Tepe may align with the rising positions of particular stars significant in the mythology of its unknown builders. If the pattern holds globally, if monumental construction routinely incorporates astronomical observation, then the absence of confirmed alignments at Gunung Padang likely reflects absence of sufficient study rather than absence of astronomical intention on the part of the builders. The underground chambers revealed by ground-penetrating radar and seismic tomography raise questions that surface observation cannot answer. If these spaces exist, what were they for? The functional interpretation that requires the fewest assumptions would be storage, protected spaces for preserving food, water or valued objects against the elements and against human predation. But storage rarely requires the geometric precision that the survey suggests these chambers possess, and storage does not explain why such spaces would be positioned beneath what appears to be a ritual platform rather than beneath domestic or administrative areas. An alternative interpretation treats the chambers as ritual spaces, locations for ceremonies that required separation from the surface world, darkness and enclosure serving theological rather than practical purposes. Many cultures worldwide have used caves and underground chambers for initiatory rites, for communication with chthonic powers, for practices whose meanings were secret and whose locations were removed from ordinary life. The acoustic properties of underground chambers add another dimension to this interpretation. Research at the Hypogeum of Halsaflieni in Malta, a subterranean temple complex dating to approximately 4000 BCE, has demonstrated that its architecture produces specific resonant frequencies when human voices sound within its spaces. The main chamber resonates at approximately 110 Hz, a frequency that research has associated with altered brain states, specifically with increased activity in the prefrontal cortex and decreased activity in the language centers, a neurological profile consistent with meditative or trance states. Similar acoustic properties have been documented at other Neolithic sites, suggesting that the builders understood, whether through intuition or through systematic experimentation, how to engineer spaces that would produce specific experiential effects on those who entered them, and spoke or sang or chanted within their walls. If the chambers beneath Gunung Padang possess similar acoustic properties, the structure becomes not merely architecture but technology, a device for producing altered states of consciousness, a machine for transforming human experience through the manipulation. This would reframe the entire purpose of the construction, treating it not as monument or temple or tomb but as functional equipment whose purpose was to do something to the people who used it. The absence of systematic acoustic study at Gunung Padang leaves this possibility suspended, neither confirmed nor refuted, another question that the structure asks and that we have not yet attempted to answer. Infrasound frequencies below the approximately 20 Hz threshold of conscious human hearing has been detected at several megalithic sites and may offer another clue to the function of underground chambers. While humans cannot consciously hear infrasound, exposure to certain infrasonic frequencies can produce physiological effects including feelings of unease, sensations of presence, visual disturbance, and alterations in emotional state. Some researchers have proposed that natural infrasound generators, such as caves with specific geometries or standing stones positioned to resonate with wind, might explain reports of supernatural experiences at ancient sites. If the chambers beneath Gunung Padang produce infrasonic frequencies through natural resonance or through deliberate design, they might create experiences that would be interpreted within the builder's cosmological framework as contact with spiritual entities, as communication with ancestors, as direct experience of the sacred powers the mountain already represented. All of this remains speculation, possibilities raised by the limited data available, rather than conclusions supported by comprehensive research. The Indonesian government has prioritized preservation of the site over invasive investigation, a policy that reflects both legitimate concerns about protecting irreplaceable cultural heritage and the political complexities of a site that has become a focal point for nationalist narratives about Indonesian historical significance. The government of President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono declared Gunung Padang a national priority site in 2014, commissioning the research that produced the controversial dating results and positioning the structure as evidence of advanced Indonesian civilization predating anything in the Western historical canon. Subsequent administrations have continued to protect the site while limiting the kind of systematic excavation that could definitively confirm or refute the claims made on its behalf. The result is a structure that keeps its secrets not because they are fundamentally inaccessible, but because we have not yet been permitted to look properly. The chambers remain unexcavated. The astronomical alignments remain unconfirmed. The acoustic properties remain unmeasured. The artifacts that might lie within the buried spaces remain uncatalogued. Everything we know about Gunung Padang comes from remote sensing and from limited surface investigation, from technologies that can detect the presence of subsurface anomalies but cannot determine their nature with precision. The radar shows voids and dense features. The seismic tomography confirms layered construction. The core samples return dates that challenge conventional chronology. But until someone excavates, until someone enters the chambers and documents what lies within, the structure will continue to raise questions it cannot answer. What purpose does a structure like this serve across 25,000 years of maintenance and modification? The honest answer is that we do not know and cannot know until we know more about the builders, about their cosmology, about their social organization, about the meanings they attach to construction and to mountains, and to the relationship between earth and sky. We can observe the pattern that appears at sacred sites worldwide, the marking of cosmologically significant locations with construction that enhances their significance, the creation of spaces designed to produce specific experiences on those who use them, the investment of generational labour in projects whose value lies not in economic return, but in spiritual or social meaning. We can note that Gunung Padang fits this pattern, that its terraced ascent and buried chambers and possible astronomical alignments all suggest the kind of cosmological architecture that has emerged independently across cultures and continents throughout human history. But pattern recognition is not explanation, similarity is not causation, and the specific meanings that Gunung Padang held for its builders remain as buried as the chambers themselves. Perhaps the most honest stance is to acknowledge that we stand before something we do not understand, something whose age exceeds our conventional timelines and whose sophistication exceeds our conventional expectations. The structure is real. The terraces climb the mountain. The stones bear the marks of intentional arrangement. The subsurface anomalies appear on every survey. The carbon dates return numbers that, if accurate, rewrite the chronology of human capability. Whether or not we understand its purpose, Gunung Padang suggests that the deeper past holds more than we have been willing to acknowledge, that the timeline we have constructed for human prehistory may be not merely incomplete but fundamentally misconceived. And if that is true, then the questions the structure raises extend far beyond this single site in West Java, reaching towards implications that touch every assumption we hold about when and where and how human beings first became capable of building worlds rather than merely inhabiting them. Chapter 7: The Sunken Continent and the Rising Waters. 20,000 years ago, the world wore a different face, and if you could stand where the South China Sea now churns with shipping traffic and fishing vessels, you would find yourself not underwater but on solid ground, looking out across a landscape of rivers and forests and coastal plains stretching unbroken from the mountains of Vietnam to the highlands of Borneo to the volcanic peaks of Java and Sumatra. This was Sundaland, a landmass the size of Western Europe that no longer exists on any map because it lies beneath the waves, drowned by the rising waters that came when the ice began to melt, and the glaciers that had locked up so much of the planet's water finally released their grip on the world. The continental shelf that now forms the shallow seabed of Southeast Asia was once dry land, and not empty land either, but territory that climate models suggest would have been among the most hospitable on Earth during the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets kilometres thick crushed northern Europe and North America beneath their weight, and the Sahara expanded to swallow most of Africa in desert. While the temperate zones suffered, Sundaland flourished. The exposed shelf created vast coastal plains where rivers meandered towards shores, now submerged beneath 40 metres of water. Tropical forests covered the interior. Game was abundant. Fresh water flowed in predictable patterns, and humans, the same anatomically modern humans who had left Africa 100,000 years earlier and spread across Asia, would have found in Sundaland something close to paradise, a refugium where populations could grow and stabilise while the rest of the world struggled against cold and drought and the brutal scarcity of the glacial age. The population estimates remain speculative, but the logic is straightforward. If Sundaland was as hospitable as the climate reconstructions suggest, and if human populations follow predictable patterns of growth in favourable conditions, then the exposed continental shelf could have supported millions of people across the millennia of the last glacial maximum. Not scattered bands of hunter-gatherers eking out survival in marginal territories, but dense populations concentrated in the most productive zones. The river deltas and coastal wetlands and forested valleys where food was abundant and the climate was kind. We cannot prove this because the evidence lies underwater, and underwater archaeology in these regions remains in its infancy, hampered by murky conditions and vast areas to search, and the simple fact that after 20,000 years, most organic material would have decomposed beyond recognition. But the genetic evidence supports the scenario. Modern Southeast Asian populations carry some of the deepest and most diverse lineages outside Africa. The Andamanese islanders, isolated for tens of thousands of years, preserve genetic signatures that diverge from mainland populations at time points consistent with very early settlement. The Orang Asli of the Malay Peninsula, the Aboriginal Australians who crossed from Sundaland to their continent at least 50,000 years ago, the Melanesian populations of Papua New Guinea, all of them carry the traces of ancient divergence events that suggest Sundaland was not a backwater but a homeland, a centre of population from which migrations flowed outward across the islands and coastlines of the Indo-Pacific world. And then the waters came, not suddenly, not in a single catastrophic flood, but in pulses that must have seemed apocalyptic to those who experienced them. Between 14,000 and 7,000 years ago, the great ice sheets of the Northern Hemisphere began their final collapse. The Laurentide ice sheet that had covered Canada and the northern United States disintegrated in stages, each collapse sending massive volumes of meltwater cascading into the oceans. Climate scientists have identified at least 3 major meltwater pulses during this period. Events that raise global sea levels by meters within centuries, sometimes within decades. Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurring around 14,000 years ago, may have raised sea levels by as much as 20 meters in less than 500 years. For populations living on low-lying coastal plains, this would not have been a gradual inconvenience, but a generational catastrophe. Coastlines would have retreated miles within a single lifetime. Fishing grounds that had sustained communities for millennia would have disappeared beneath the waves. River mouths would have migrated inland, disrupting the estuarine ecosystems that provided the richest harvests. And the sacred places, the ancestral sites, the monuments, if any existed, would have slipped beneath the surface one by one, visible for a time as shallows and then as nothing at all, gone into the memory of the sea. Consider what this would have meant for the people living through it. Each generation would have known that the waters were higher than their parents remembered, that islands their grandparents had visited no longer existed, that the stories told by elders described a world that could no longer be found. The old people would have spoken of villages now underwater, of hunting grounds now drowned, of mountains that had become islands and islands that had vanished entirely. And each generation would have watched the process continue, watching the coastline retreat, watching the familiar world shrink, knowing that their children would inherit even less than they had received. This is not the flood of mythology understood as divine punishment for human wickedness. This is the flood as lived experience, as multi-generational trauma, as the slow drowning of everything the ancestors had built. The survivors would have had nowhere to go but up. As the waters rose, the populations of Sundaland would have been compressed into smaller and smaller territories, crowding onto the highlands that eventually became the islands of modern Indonesia. The mountains that had been interior features of a continental landmass became refugia, the only dry ground remaining as the continental shelf flooded beneath them. And Gunung Padang sits precisely where such refugees would have arrived, on the western edge of Java, facing the waters that had swallowed their former homeland, looking out across what had become a sea but had once been their world. This reframes everything about the site. If the deep layers of Gunung Padang were constructed during the last glacial maximum, then they were not built by an isolated population on a volcanic mountainside, but by people connected to the broader world of Sundaland, people whose cultural networks extended across territories now drowned, whose knowledge systems were part of a larger complex we can no longer access directly because it lies under 40 meters of water. The structure might not represent the origin of a civilization, but its survival, the point where something older managed to persist when everything else was lost. The terraces climbing the mountain might not be a temple to gods, but a memorial to the dead, to the ancestors whose graves were underwater, to the cities and villages and sacred places that the rising waters had claimed. Or perhaps the structure served as something even more practical, a marker for those who came after, a message carved in stone because stone endures when everything else fails, saying we were here, this is what we knew, remember what the waters took. The flood narratives that appear in virtually every ancient culture have long puzzled scholars because of their universality. The Mesopotamian accounts, the biblical Genesis, the Hindu Matsya Purana, the Greek Deucalion, the Aztec stories, the Aboriginal Australian accounts of the Dreamtime floods, the Chinese legends of Gun Yu controlling the waters, all of them describe a world drowned by rising seas and humanity surviving by finding high ground or building vessels that could ride out the deluge. The conventional interpretation treats these as mythology, symbolic narratives addressing psychological needs or explaining natural phenomena through supernatural frameworks. But the end of the Ice Age was not a symbolic event. It was a real catastrophe that drowned millions of square kilometers of inhabited land over the course of a few thousand years. The populations who experienced it would have passed down memories of the drowning, and those memories would have been shaped by retelling across generations, accumulating supernatural elements as the original witnesses died and their descendants inherited stories rather than experiences. By the time the flood narratives were written down in Mesopotamia and Egypt and India and China, thousands of years had passed since the waters stopped rising. The stories had become myth, but myth is not fiction. Myth is memory transformed by time, shaped by the needs of the cultures that preserved it, but still anchored in events that actually occurred. If the flood narratives preserve collective memory of the end of the Ice Age, then they are not explaining where humans came from but documenting what humans lost. The world before the flood was not a golden age invented for theological purposes. It was a real place now underwater, where real people lived and built and maintained cultures we cannot access because the evidence is 40 meters down and spread across an area the size of Western Europe. And Gunung Padang, standing at the edge of that drowned world, might be the clearest surviving link to what existed before the waters rose. Not a beginning but an end, or perhaps an ending that became a beginning, the point where enough survived that something could be rebuilt, maintained, passed forward into the ages that followed. Chapter 8. Other anomalies. Other silences. If Gunung Padang represents a survivor from a lost epoch, a structure that persisted when its surrounding context was drowned, then we should expect to find other survivors, other points where the destruction was incomplete, other anomalies that refuse to fit the conventional timeline of human development. And when we look, we find them, scattered across the planet, each generating the same pattern of intriguing evidence, followed by academic controversy, followed by institutional dominance. Consider Göbekli Tepe. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating a hilltop in southeastern Turkey that local farmers had dismissed as inconvenient because the stones kept breaking their ploughs. What Schmidt uncovered over the next 2 decades transformed our understanding of the Neolithic period and raised questions that remain unanswered. The site consists of massive stone circles featuring T-shaped pillars weighing up to 20 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals, symbols, and humanoid figures. The oldest layers date to approximately 1100 years ago, the very end of the Younger Dryas Cold period, when according to conventional chronology, humans were small bands of hunter-gatherers without the social organisation or technical capacity for monumental construction. Yet here were structures requiring quarrying, transport, carving, and assembly on a scale that should have been impossible without agriculture, without cities, without the accumulated surplus that supposedly enables complex societies to emerge. The conventional response was to revise the model rather than the chronology, to suggest that Göbekli Tepe might represent the catalyst for the Neolithic revolution rather than its product, that the desire to build monumentally might have motivated the development of agriculture rather than resulting from it. This is plausible, and it rescues the fundamental timeline, but it creates its own problems. If hunter-gatherers could organise the labour and technical expertise for Göbekli Tepe, what else could they have organised? And why does Göbekli Tepe appear without precedent, without the developmental stages that should precede such sophisticated construction? The site has no known precursors. It emerges fully formed, as if the builders arrived already knowing how to quarry and carve and assemble, already possessing the organisational capacity for large-scale collective projects. And then, around 10,000 years ago, the builders deliberately buried the site, filling the stone circles with rubble and abandoning the hilltop to millennia of forgetting until Schmidt's excavations revealed what had been hidden. Why bury what had taken generations to build? The conventional interpretation suggests ritual closure, the sacred ending of a sacred place. But an alternative reading is possible. What if Göbekli Tepe was buried not to end its use but to preserve it, to protect the stones from whatever catastrophe the builders anticipated, to ensure that something would survive for those who came after? The burial would then be not an ending, but an act of transmission, a message in stone sealed against time, waiting to be discovered. The pattern repeats elsewhere with variations. The Giza Plateau, home to the pyramids and the Sphinx, has generated decades of controversy over the water erosion hypothesis proposed by geologist Robert Schoch in the early 1990s. Schoch argued that the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure walls were consistent with prolonged exposure to rainfall, not wind and sand, and that such rainfall had not occurred in Egypt since before 5000 BCE, thousands of years before the conventional dating of the Sphinx to around 2500 BCE. If the erosion is from rainfall, the Sphinx must be older than the pharaonic civilization that supposedly built it, potentially dating to a wetter climatic period at the end of the Ice Age. Egyptologists dismissed the hypothesis, arguing that the erosion could be explained by other mechanisms, that no archaeological evidence supports such an early date, that the entire proposal was motivated by pseudoscientific agendas rather than genuine inquiry. But dismissal is not refutation. The erosion patterns remain. The questions Schoch raised have never been definitively answered, only ignored. And the alignment of the pyramid internal shafts to star positions as they would have appeared around 10 to 500 BCE, noted by researchers Robert Bovell and Graham Hancock, adds another layer to the mystery. If the alignments are intentional, they encode astronomical knowledge from an epoch predating dynastic Egypt by millennia. If they are coincidental, the coincidence is remarkably precise. The pattern is the same, intriguing evidence generating controversy, controversy generating dismissal, dismissal generating silence, and the questions remaining open beneath the official closure. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes another mechanism for understanding these anomalies. Around 12,800 years ago, at the onset of the Younger Dryas Cold period, something catastrophic occurred. The megafauna of North America, the mammoths and mastodons and giant ground sloths that had survived multiple glacial cycles, suddenly went extinct. The Clovis culture, the first well-documented human presence in the Americas, disappeared at the same moment. A boundary layer in geological deposits from this period contains anomalous concentrations of nanodiamonds, iridium, and other materials consistent with a cosmic impact, similar to the layer that marks the extinction of the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. The hypothesis, first formally proposed in 2007 by Richard Firestone and colleagues, suggests that a comet or asteroid struck the Laurentide ice sheet, triggering massive flooding, continent-wide wildfires, and a sudden return to glacial conditions that lasted over 1,000 years. The impact would have been catastrophic for any populations in its path, and the climatic aftermath would have disrupted human societies across the Northern Hemisphere and beyond. If the hypothesis is correct, the Younger Dryas impact would represent exactly the kind of catastrophic reset that could explain why sophisticated capabilities appear to have existed before the event, while development seems to restart from simpler foundations afterward. The gap in the record would not be absence of capability, but destruction of evidence. Not primitive development, but interrupted transmission. Other sites contribute to the pattern. The Yonaguni Monument, discovered in 1987 off the coast of Japan, consists of massive stone structures featuring right angles, terraces, and what appear to be carved staircases, all submerged beneath 25 meters of water. If the structures are human-made, they date to before the last glacial flooding, potentially 10,000 years ago or earlier. Marine geologists have argued the formations are natural, the result of geological processes that can produce right angles in certain types of rock. But the debate continues, and the structures have never been systematically excavated. Dwarka, the legendary city of Krishna mentioned in the Mahabharata, was discovered submerged off the coast of Gujarat, India, in 1983. Marine archaeological surveys revealed structures, pottery and artifacts consistent with an urban settlement, dating to approximately 9,000 years ago, based on submerged shoreline chronology. The site matches descriptions in ancient texts of a city destroyed by the sea, a city whose ruins would be found underwater by those who sought them. In each case, the same pattern emerges. Evidence is found that challenges the conventional timeline. The evidence is specific enough to demand explanation. Experts offer alternative interpretations that preserve the established framework. The controversy generates heat but not resolution, and eventually the topic fades from mainstream discussion, not because the questions were answered, but because asking them became professionally risky. What if these are not isolated anomalies but connected survivors? What if Gunung Padang in Indonesia, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the possibly older Sphinx in Egypt, the submerged structures at Yonaguni and Dwarka, the impact layer of the Younger Dryas, all of them represent fragmentary evidence of a phase of human capability that was largely destroyed by the catastrophes at the end of the Ice Age. The connections would not require a single unified civilization spanning the globe. They would only require that the conditions of the last glacial maximum, which concentrated human populations in refugia and provided stable environments for cultural development over tens of thousands of years, allowed sophisticated traditions to emerge in multiple locations independently. The catastrophic flooding and climatic disruption at the end of the Ice Age would have destroyed most evidence of these traditions, leaving only survivors at scattered points where geography allowed something to persist. The Mesopotamian king lists describing rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years before the flood, the Egyptian records of the Shemsu-Hor who governed it before the first pharaohs, the Hindu descriptions of earlier yugas when knowledge was complete. All of these would then be not mythology but degraded memory, the echo of a reality that could no longer be directly accessed but refused to be completely forgotten. Gunung Padang would be the oldest visible point of this lost network, the structure whose deep layers preserve the earliest datable evidence of monumental construction, but it would not be alone. It would be part of a pattern that only becomes visible when you stop dismissing the anomalies and start asking what they might have in common. Chapter 9: The Global Memory of Lost Knowledge. The pattern that emerges from these scattered sites and contested datings is not primarily archaeological, but epistemological. It concerns how knowledge is described, how cultures understand the origins of what they know, and whether the consistent claims of inheritance across unconnected civilizations might preserve a truth that the physical evidence can only partially confirm. Return for a moment to Mesopotamia, to the clay tablets and cylinder seals and temple archives discussed in the earlier scripts. The Sumerians, who developed the first writing system and built the first cities according to conventional chronology, never claimed to have invented civilization. Their texts describe the Emi, the fundamental principles of civilized existence as having been given by the Anunnaki, beings who descended from the heavens and established the order that humans then maintained. The king lists describe rulers who governed for tens of thousands of years before the flood, and the scribes who copied these lists did not distinguish between the mythological sections and the historical ones. They recorded both with the same administrative precision, as though both were equally factual, equally part of the documented record of how governance descended from the cosmic to the human realm. The temples were not built, but restored, rebuilt to match patterns established in former times. The laws were not invented, but reinstated, enforced because they were eternal rather than because any human authority had created them. The Egyptian pattern is similar, though the names differ. The Turin King list, discussed earlier, records the reigns of the gods before the pharaohs, the Zep-Tepi, or first time when divine beings walked the earth and established the foundations of order. The pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings in Egypt, describe this first time as an age when the gods and humans interacted directly, when knowledge was transmitted rather than discovered, when the models for temples and pyramids and proper governance were established by beings whose nature transcended the human. Later pharaohs described themselves as maintaining what had been established, not as innovating or improving. The temples were built according to ancient plans. The rituals followed patterns set in the first time. Innovation was suspect because it implied departure from the perfect models that had been given at the beginning. This is not the psychology of a civilization confident in its own achievements. This is the psychology of inheritors, of people maintaining something they believe they did not create and could not recreate if it were lost. Hindu tradition encodes a similar understanding through the concept of the yugas, the great ages that cycle through decline and renewal. The Satya Yuga, the first age, was characterized by complete dharma, direct divine presence, and perfect knowledge. Each subsequent yuga saw decline, reduction of dharmic order, withdrawal of divine involvement, loss of capabilities that had been present in the earlier age. The current Kali Yuga is the darkest, the furthest from the original perfection, and the ancient texts describe it as an age when truth is obscured, when sacred knowledge is forgotten or corrupted, when humanity operates at a fraction of its former capability. This is not a narrative of progress, it is a narrative of loss, of something magnificent that existed at the beginning and has been degrading ever since. The temples and practices and texts that survive are understood as fragments of what once was, incomplete transmissions from an age that cannot be recovered, maintained as best as possible against the entropic tide of the declining yuga. Chinese tradition preserves the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, figures who ruled before the historical dynasties and who are credited with teaching humanity the arts of civilization. Fuxi revealed the I Ching and taught the principles of writing and music. Shen Nong taught agriculture and herbal medicine. The Yellow Emperor established social order, governmental structures, and the fundamentals of Chinese civilization. These figures are not described as inventors but as revealers, not as creators of knowledge but as transmitters of knowledge that existed before them and was passed to humanity through their agency. The pattern is identical to the Mesopotamian and Egyptian models. Knowledge descends, humans receive. The role of later generations is to maintain what was given, not to improve upon perfection. Indigenous Australian traditions extend this pattern into even deeper time. The songlines that crisscross the continent encode geographic, ecological, and spiritual knowledge in musical form, allowing navigation across vast distances and transmission of complex information without writing. These songlines are described as having been created in the Dreamtime, the epoch before the current age when ancestral beings shaped the land and established the patterns that humans now follow. The knowledge is not learned but inherited, passed through initiations that connect the individual to the ancestral transmission, making them a link in a chain that extends backward, beyond history, into a foundational age that still exists parallel to ordinary time. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests continuous Aboriginal occupation of Australia for at least 50,000 years, making this the longest unbroken cultural tradition in human history. If the songlines encode knowledge accumulated across that vast time span, they represent a form of cultural memory more ancient than any written record, more enduring than any stone monument. Polynesian navigation presents another example. When European explorers first encountered Pacific Island societies, they were astonished by the navigational capabilities that had allowed settlement of islands scattered across thousands of miles of open ocean. The Polynesians navigated without instruments, reading star patterns, wave interference, bird flight, and subtle environmental cues to cross distances that European sailors could only manage with compass and sextant. This was not primitive knowledge but sophisticated science, accumulated over generations and transmitted through oral traditions that encoded astronomical and oceanographic information in memorable forms. The Europeans assumed they were discovering these capabilities for the first time. The Polynesians knew they were practicing what their ancestors had taught them, maintaining a tradition that stretched back to the original voyages from Southeast Asia thousands of years before. The pattern, when viewed globally, becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Cultures that had no contact with each other, separated by oceans and continents and millennia, independently developed the same epistemological framework. Knowledge was given, not invented. Civilization was inherited, not created. The role of each generation was to maintain the transmission, to pass forward what had been received, to prevent further loss. If this framework were merely psychological, a universal human tendency to project authority onto imagined ancestors, we would expect it to appear in variable forms reflecting local conditions, but the forms are remarkably consistent. The Sumerian Anunnaki, the Egyptian gods of the Zep Tepi, the Hindu devas of the Satya Yuga, the Chinese three sovereigns, the Aboriginal ancestral beings, the Polynesian founding navigators, all of them function identically in their respective traditions. They establish order, they transmit knowledge, they withdraw or diminish or die, and humans are left to maintain what remains. What if they were telling the truth? Not literal truth, not gods descending from heaven in the supernatural sense, but cultural truth. The accurate transmission of a memory that something sophisticated existed before the current age, and that what came after was reconstruction rather than creation. The end of the Ice Age destroyed most physical evidence of whatever existed during the last glacial maximum. The rising waters drowned Sunderland and the continental shelves worldwide. The climatic disruption of the Younger Dryas would have collapsed any societies dependent on stable environmental conditions. But cultural memory can survive when physical evidence cannot. Stories can be transmitted when monuments are destroyed. Practices can be maintained when the reasons for them are forgotten. And across thousands of years of telling, the memories would have accumulated supernatural elements, the original transmitters becoming gods, the original events becoming cosmic dramas, the original knowledge becoming sacred revelation. If fragments of Ice Age capability really did survive the catastrophes at the end of the glacial period, we would expect exactly the pattern we observe. Scattered sites like Gunung Padang and Göbekli Tepe where physical evidence persists despite the destruction. Global traditions describing knowledge as inherited from an earlier age, and cultures organising themselves around preservation rather than innovation, maintaining what was given rather than creating something new. The Neolithic Revolution would then be not a revolution at all, but a restoration. Not the first emergence of civilization, but its reconstruction from fragments preserved by survivors of the flood. Gunung Padang would represent the oldest visible point of that lost network, the structure whose deep layers carry us back furthest into the age before the waters rose. But the structure would be meaningful not in isolation, but as confirmation of what the global traditions have been saying all along. Something existed before, something was lost. And what we call the beginning of history might be better understood as the beginning of recovery, the moment when enough fragments remained that the work of restoration could begin. Chapter 10: The Archaeology of Silence. In the quiet corridors of academic institutions, in the peer review processes that determine what gets published and what gets ignored, in the funding decisions that shape which excavations proceed and which proposals gather dust in filing cabinets, there exists a phenomenon that future historians will struggle to explain. The silence surrounding Gunung Padang is not the absence of evidence, but the presence of a choice, a collective decision by the gatekeepers of historical knowledge to look away from data that challenges the frameworks upon which careers have been built and textbooks have been written. This is not conspiracy in the dramatic sense, not coordinated suppression by shadowy figures protecting ancient secrets, but something more mundane and perhaps more troubling. The natural human tendency to dismiss what does not fit, to require extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims, while simultaneously refusing to fund the investigations that could provide such evidence. The excavation that could answer every question about Gunung Padang has not been conducted, not because the technology is lacking, not because the site is inaccessible, but because the will to know has not overcome the fear of what knowing might require us to accept. Consider the professional landscape that any researcher must navigate when approaching anomalous claims about human antiquity. Graham Hancock, whose books have sold millions of copies and whose Netflix documentary introduced Gunung Padang to global audiences, is routinely dismissed as a pseudo-archaeologist, a term that functions less as a scientific classification than as a warning label designed to protect readers from dangerous ideas. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, who proposed that water erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure indicate a construction date thousands of years earlier than the conventional timeline, found his academic reputation permanently marked by his willingness to follow geological evidence where it led rather than where Egyptology preferred it to go. The pattern is consistent. Researchers who investigate anomalous claims do not have their findings debunked through rigorous counter-evidence. They have their credentials questioned, their motivations impugned, their access to funding and publication quietly restricted. The distinction between debunked and never seriously investigated is crucial and rarely acknowledged. To debunk a claim requires engaging with it, testing its evidence, proposing alternative explanations that better account for the data. What happens instead is something closer to dismissal, a wave of the hand, a knowing smile, a refusal to waste time on claims that are obviously wrong because they contradict what is already known to be true. But what is known to be true was itself once unknown, once controversial, once dismissed by the authorities of an earlier era. The history of science is littered with paradigms that seemed unassailable until they collapsed, with experts who were certain until certainty proved unfounded, with gatekeepers who protected knowledge until the gates were overwhelmed by the weight of evidence they had refused to examine. The Indonesian government's position on Gunung Padang reflects a different set of priorities than those of the international archaeological community. For Indonesian officials, the site represents national heritage, a source of cultural pride, potential tourist destination, and a politically sensitive symbol of the nation's deep roots in human history. The decision to prioritize preservation over excavation makes a certain kind of sense from this perspective. Better to protect the structure for future generations than to risk damaging it through investigations whose methods might be questioned and whose findings might be disputed. But preservation without investigation is its own form of destruction, not of the physical structure but of the knowledge it contains. Every year that passes without systematic excavation is a year in which the questions remain unanswered, the controversy continues, and the site exists in a limbo between anomaly and explanation. The international archaeological community, for its part, has adopted a posture of studied indifference. The 23 paper in Archaeological Prospection, authored by Danny Hillman Natawijaja and colleagues from multiple institutions, presented detailed evidence for multi-phase construction extending back tens of thousands of years. The paper passed peer review, was published in a respected journal, and should by all normal standards have sparked intense interest and follow-up investigation. Instead, silence. The major archaeological publications did not cover the findings. The prominent researchers in related fields did not rush to Indonesia to examine the evidence firsthand. The funding bodies did not announce new initiatives to investigate the implications. The paper exists, the data exists, the questions exist, but the response from the establishment has been a collective shrug, a determination to wait and see, to let someone else take the professional risk of engaging seriously with claims that, if validated, would require rewriting the textbooks that current scholars spent their careers helping to write. What is lost when controversial evidence is dismissed rather than examined? The question itself reveals the stakes involved. If Gunung Padang is what the evidence suggests, then every delay in investigation is a delay in understanding something fundamental about human capability and human history. If the site is not what the evidence suggests, if the dates are somehow mistaken, if the structures are natural formations misinterpreted as architecture, then rigorous investigation would establish this and put the controversy to rest. The only outcome that serves no one is the current situation. Claims too significant to ignore, evidence too anomalous to accept, and a collective decision to neither confirm nor refute but simply to wait, to let the question hang unanswered while careers proceed and funding flows to safer projects. The Clovis first paradigm offers a useful parallel and perhaps a reason for cautious optimism. For decades, the archaeological establishment insisted that humans first entered the Americas approximately 13,000 years ago, crossing the Bering Land Bridge and spreading south through an ice-free corridor. Evidence suggesting earlier occupation was dismissed, often harshly. Sites that produced pre-Clovis dates were accused of contamination, misinterpretation, or outright fraud. Researchers who proposed alternative models found themselves marginalized. Their findings questioned not on their merits but on their implications. The paradigm held because the paradigm was convenient, because it provided a tidy narrative, because challenging it required challenging the scholars who had built their reputations defending it. And then the paradigm collapsed. Monteverde in Chile, Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, the Turuti Mastodon site in California. Evidence accumulated that could no longer be explained away, that demanded either engagement or willful blindness. The establishment chose engagement, eventually, reluctantly, and the textbooks were rewritten. Humans arrived in the Americas earlier than Clovis, perhaps much earlier, perhaps by routes that had nothing to do with the Bering Land Bridge. The new paradigm is messier, more uncertain, more open to further revision. But it is closer to the truth, and it emerged only because the evidence eventually became undeniable, because the silence could no longer hold against the weight of what the sites revealed. Could the same thing happen with Ice Age civilization? The question is not whether it will happen, but when, and at what cost in lost time and lost knowledge. Every paradigm that has ever collapsed seemed invincible until the moment it fell. Every truth that is now accepted was once controversial, once dismissed, once dangerous to speak aloud. The researchers who first proposed that the Earth orbited the Sun, that diseases were caused by microscopic organisms, that continents drifted across the surface of the planet, were not celebrated in their time but ridiculed, marginalized, forced to wait for vindication that often came only after their deaths. The pattern is so consistent that it has a name, the Semmelweis reflex, named for the physician who discovered that hand-washing could prevent childbed fever and was driven to madness by his colleagues' refusal to accept evidence that implicated their own practices in the deaths of their patients. The silence surrounding Gunung Padang is itself a historical phenomenon, one that future generations will study and struggle to understand. They will ask why the evidence was ignored, why the excavations were not funded, why the questions were allowed to hang unanswered for decades while the technology to resolve them existed, and the site sat waiting in the green mountains of West Java. They will not understand the professional pressures, the funding constraints, the career risks that made silence the safer choice. They will see only the gap, the lost decades, the knowledge that could have been gained and was not because the will to know did not overcome the fear of what knowing might require. But paradigms do change eventually, inevitably. The evidence does not disappear simply because it is ignored. The stones of Gunung Padang do not erode because archaeologists decline to study them. The chambers beneath the surface do not collapse because funding bodies prefer to invest in safer projects. Time moves in one direction, and in that direction lies either investigation or continued ignorance, either answers or the perpetual postponement of questions that will not stop being asked simply because the asking is inconvenient. The frustration is real, but so is the patience required to wait for the moment when the paradigm begins to crack, when the first mainstream researchers risk their reputations to take the evidence seriously, when the silence finally breaks and the investigation begins. Chapter 11. Rewriting the Timeline. The current paradigm for human civilization rests on a series of assumptions so deeply embedded in academic discourse that they are rarely stated explicitly, functioning instead as unexamined premises that shape every conclusion drawn from the evidence. The first assumption is that civilization, defined as the complex of traits including monumental architecture, social stratification, specialized labor, and symbolic communication systems, emerged approximately 6,000 years ago in the river valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt. The second assumption is that this emergence was enabled by the development of agriculture, which produced food surpluses that freed portions of the population from subsistence activities and allowed them to engage in the specialized work of building, governing, and recording. The third assumption is that monumental architecture, specifically the construction of structures too large to serve immediate practical purposes, began approximately 11,600 years ago at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, a site that challenged earlier assumptions by demonstrating that hunter-gatherers could organize collective labor on a massive scale even without agricultural surplus. The fourth assumption, perhaps the most fundamental, is that human cognitive capacity has been essentially constant for the past 50,000 years or more, meaning that the differences between ancient peoples and ourselves lie not in our brains, but in our circumstances, our accumulated knowledge, our technologies, and our social organizations. These assumptions form a coherent framework, a story we tell ourselves about how we became what we are. But if Gunung Padang is what the evidence suggests, if the core of the structure truly dates to 25,000 years ago, then every element of this framework requires revision. And the story we have been telling ourselves collapses into something far more complex and far more strange. If Gunung Padang is 25,000 years old, then monumental architecture does not begin at Göbekli Tepe, but more than twice as far back in time, in a period we call the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere, and sea levels stood more than 100 meters lower than today. The implication is staggering. The human capacity for organized collective labor, for transforming landscapes according to abstract designs, for creating structures that served symbolic rather than immediately practical purposes, existed not 11,000 years ago, but 25,000 years ago. Not as a new development, but as something already ancient, when the ice began to melt and the world we recognize started to take shape. If Gunung Padang is 25,000 years old, then the requirement for agricultural surplus as a precondition for monumentality is simply wrong. The peoples who carved the core of the structure from volcanic rock, who shaped chambers and passages and terraces according to designs we cannot yet fully reconstruct, did so without domesticated plants, without permanent agricultural settlements, without the food surpluses that supposedly enable civilizational complexity. They did so as hunter-gatherers, if that term even applies, or perhaps as something else entirely, something for which we do not yet have a name because we have not previously recognized its existence. The hunter-gatherer label itself becomes problematic, a category that may describe subsistence strategy but clearly fails to describe cognitive capacity, organizational ability, or cultural sophistication. If Gunung Padang is 25,000 years old, then Southeast Asia, not the Fertile Crescent, may be the origin point of monumental architecture and perhaps of other elements of civilizational complexity that we have attributed to later and more westerly societies. The implications for our understanding of cultural transmission, of the routes by which knowledge and technology spread across the ancient world, are profound. The conventional narrative places the origins of everything in the Middle East, with complexity radiating outward to Europe, to Asia, to Africa, and eventually across the oceans to the Americas and the Pacific. But if the oldest monumental structure on Earth sits in West Java, then the arrows of influence may run in different directions, or in multiple directions simultaneously, or in patterns far more complex than the simple diffusion model allows. If Gunung Padang is 25,000 years old, then what we call ancient history becomes Middle History, a relatively recent phase in a much longer story. The 6,000 years since the emergence of Sumerian civilization, the 11,000 years since Göbekli Tepe, the 12,000 years since the end of the Ice Age, all of these become episodes in a larger narrative that extends twice as far into the past as we have previously imagined. The deep past grows deeper still, and the darkness before the dawn of civilization becomes not the absence of human achievement but the presence of achievements we have not yet learned to see. If Gunung Padang is 25,000 years old, then the peoples of the Ice Age were not waiting to develop civilization, were not precursors to something that would come later, were not primitives whose potential would only be realized by their distant descendants. They may have already had what we call civilization, or something analogous to it, or something different from it in ways we cannot yet articulate. The lost civilization is perhaps not one society, not Atlantis or Mu or Lemuria, not a single advanced culture destroyed by catastrophe and forgotten by history, but a different phase of human capability, a period when our species was already doing things we thought only more recent peoples could do. If Gunung Padang is 25,000 years old, then the flood myths that appear in virtually every ancient culture, the stories of waters rising and worlds drowning, and survivors preserving knowledge from before the catastrophe, are not mythology but memory. The end of the Ice Age brought sea level rises that inundated coastlines around the world, that swallowed Sunderland and Doggerland and Beringia, and countless other lands that had been home to human populations for millennia. If those populations had built monumentally, had developed complex cultures, had accumulated knowledge worth preserving, then the flood myths would be exactly what we should expect. The memory of that phase ending, transmitted across generations in the only form available before writing, distorted by time but never entirely forgotten. The pattern the Mesopotamians described, knowledge inherited from before the flood, administered by beings who governed and then withdrew, becomes not a creation myth, but a memory of succession, of one phase giving way to another, of humanity stepping into a diminished world and trying to maintain what had been given. What we call the Neolithic Revolution, the transition from foraging to farming that supposedly enabled everything that followed, becomes not a revolution but a recovery, not the origin of civilization but its restoration after catastrophe. The peoples who built the first cities in Mesopotamia, who raised the first pyramids in Egypt, who developed the first writing systems and legal codes and astronomical observations, may have been doing what the texts themselves suggest, not inventing but remembering, not creating but reconstructing, not beginning but continuing. The intellectual vertigo is considerable. Every textbook would need to be revised, every timeline redrawn, every assumption about the trajectory of human development reconsidered. The resistance to this reconsidering is understandable, even natural, because paradigms exist precisely to make the world comprehensible, to provide frameworks within which evidence can be interpreted and knowledge can accumulate. But paradigms also exist to be replaced when the evidence demands it, and the question is whether the evidence from Gunung Padang demands replacement or merely revision, whether the anomaly is real or apparent, whether the dates are accurate or mistaken. The only way to answer that question is to investigate, and the investigation has not occurred, and so the question hangs in the air like the silence after a bell stops ringing, present, palpable, impossible to answer without the effort no one has been willing to make. And Gunung Padang sits at the threshold, the oldest visible point of something we can only glimpse, a structure that may be the survivor of an epoch we have not yet learned to see, the tangible edge of a history so much larger than the one we thought we knew, that standing before it is like standing at the edge of an ocean whose far shore no one has ever seen. Chapter 12, Heirs of the Builders. In the villages surrounding Gunung Padang, there are people who still come to the terraces to pray. They bring offerings, flowers, incense, small portions of food arranged on banana leaves. They speak words that have been passed down through generations, addressing the spirits of the place, the ancestors who are believed to dwell within the stones, the powers that have made the mountain sacred for longer than anyone can remember. When asked why they do this, why they consider this particular mountain more sacred than others, why these particular stones deserve reverence, they cannot explain in terms that would satisfy an archaeologist or a historian. The knowledge has been lost. What remains is the practice, the behavior, the pattern of action that has been transmitted from parent to child for so many generations that its origin has disappeared into the unreachable past. Perhaps that is what survival looks like across 25,000 years. Not texts, not explanations, not detailed accounts of who built the structure and why, and what it was for, but something simpler and more durable. The feeling that this place matters, the compulsion to maintain connection with it, the practice of reverence that continues even when the reasons for reverence have been forgotten. Scholars call this intangible cultural heritage, but the term is too abstract to capture what it really is. It is memory embedded in behavior, knowledge preserved not in words but in actions, a message transmitted through time by the simple fact of its repetition. The villagers do not know they are preserving something 25 millennia old. They know only that their parents did this, and their grandparents, and their great-grandparents stretching back beyond any genealogy they can recite. They know that the mountain feels different, that the stones hold something, that the practice matters even if they cannot say why. And in that practice, in that feeling, in that inarticulate sense of significance, something has survived that all the libraries and archives and digital databases of the modern world could not preserve with equal fidelity. We are all inheritors. Every language we speak carries within it the traces of languages that came before, words borrowed from neighbours, grammatical structures evolved from ancestral tongues, sounds that once meant something to peoples whose names we will never know. Every technology we use builds on technologies whose origins are forgotten. Innovations made by anonymous experimenters who never recorded their discoveries but passed them on through practice and imitation until they became so ubiquitous that no one thought to ask where they came from. Every story we tell echoes older stories whose tellers are silent. Narratives shaped by the same human concerns across cultures and centuries, the same fears and hopes and questions recurring in different guises, because they arise from what we are rather than where we happen to live. We inherit without knowing we inherit. We receive without knowing we receive, We maintain practices and speak words and use tools and tell stories that connect us to a past so deep that its beginning is invisible. A chain of transmission that stretches back not merely to the earliest written records, but to the first humans who taught their children, and those children taught theirs, and so on, through an unbroken sequence that has never stopped, that continues in this moment as you listen to these words and carry them forward into whatever comes next. If Gunung Padang is what the evidence suggests, it is a message from the deep past, but not a message in any conventional sense. There is no writing on the stones, no inscription explaining who built them and why, no code waiting to be cracked by the sufficiently clever analysts. The message, if it is a message, is simpler and more profound. We were here, we could do this, we did do this, and now you stand where we stood and see what we made. Not a message we can read, but a message we can stand before. Not instructions, but presence. Not information, but the irreducible fact of existence across time, so vast that the mind struggles to encompass it. The terraces still climb the mountain, green with the growth of plants whose seeds were carried by birds and wind to soil that accumulated in the crevices between stones. The chambers wait underground, their interiors unexplored, their purposes unknown, their silence holding whatever the silence holds. The stones that were ancient when Egypt was young continue to hold their form, weathered by rain and wind and the slow chemistry of tropical air, but still standing, still marking the place, still waiting for whatever comes next. 25,000 years ago, if the dates are accurate, someone decided that this mountain should be shaped, that these stones should be arranged, that something should exist here that would not exist if humans did not make it. We do not know their names. We do not know their language. We do not know what they believed, what they feared, what they hoped for, what they thought would become of the thing they were making. We know only that they made it, and that it endured, and that now we stand before it asking questions they cannot answer, because they are not here to answer them, because 25 millennia have passed and everything they were, except this structure, has been swallowed by time. And yet, the villagers still come to pray, the offerings still appear on the stones, the practice continues, and in that continuation something survives that is not the structure itself but the relationship to the structure, the recognition that it matters, the maintenance of connection across gaps of time that should have severed every thread. Perhaps that is the message, if there is a message. Not the stones, but the care for the stones. Not the architecture, but the reverence for the architecture. Not what was built, but the building itself as an act of faith that the future would exist, that someone would come after, that the effort would not be wasted even if its meaning was forgotten. We are the ones who came after. We are the future they built for, and now the question is not whether we can understand them, but whether we can be worthy of what they made, whether we can maintain the connection they established, whether we can pass it forward as they passed it forward, through all the years that have yet to come. The mountain still rises in West Java. Farmers still work the surrounding rice paddies, bending to the rhythms of planting and harvest as their ancestors did before them, as their descendants will do after them if the world allows. The stones that witnessed the Ice Age still face the sky, polygonal columns of basalt arranged by hands that reached out from a time so distant that no other trace of those hands remains. We do not know who built the core of Gunung Padang. We do not know what they knew that we have forgotten. We do not know what else lies beneath the waters that rose when the world warmed, what other structures wait on the drowned continental shelves, what other evidence of Ice Age capability rests in darkness beneath the waves. We know only that the silence of 25,000 years does not mean nothing happened. It means we have not learned to listen yet. It means the questions we ask shape the answers we can receive, and we have not yet learned to ask the questions that would let the past speak. Perhaps that is what history really is. Not the story of what we achieved, not the triumphant narrative of progress from primitive to modern, from ignorance to knowledge, from weakness to power. Perhaps history is the story of what we are still trying to remember, the fragments we carry without knowing we carry them, the practices we maintain without knowing why, the feeling that something came before us and that we are responsible for what comes after. The structure was not built for us. The builders did not know we would exist, could not imagine the world we inhabit, had no way to address us across the chasm of time that separates their world from ours. But the structure waited for us to find it, endured through ice ages and floods and the rise and fall of all the civilizations that came and went while it remained, and now it stands as it has stood for longer than we can properly imagine, asking nothing, offering nothing, simply being what it is. The oldest, perhaps, of all the things that human hands have made. And now the question is ours. Not what did they build, or why did they build it, or how did they build it, though those questions matter and deserve answers we do not yet have. The question is, what will we do with what the stones reveal? Will we investigate or ignore? Will we revise our understanding or protect our assumptions? Will we listen to the silence or turn away from questions too large for comfort? The mountain does not care. The stones do not wait for our answer. They simply are, as they have been for 25,000 years, as they will be for 25,000 more if we do not destroy them, holding whatever they hold, meaning whatever they mean, ancient when the world was young, and ancient still as the world grows old around them.